This is Akashvani. In the program Money Talk, now we bring you a discussion on India's G20 presidency and reforming international financial architecture. The participants are Sushma Ramachandran, economic analyst, and Lalima Aneja, anchor.
The G20 meeting on finance started yesterday, where finance ministers of the countries and governors of their central banks met in Gandhinagar. Our Honourable Finance Minister, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, was also present to discuss the agenda at the G20 meeting. Well, the focus was on global debt, vulnerabilities, and eliminating poverty, and much, much more. Well, to discuss this and lots more, we have with us Ms. Sushma Ramachandran, our financial expert for now. Welcome, Sushma.
Thank you, Lalima.
What was the agenda in this meeting which started yesterday? Of course, one of the agendas was the reformation of multilateral development banks. Do you think that it's possible because they are very big?
Yes, well, there were a lot of issues that were to be taken up. Of course, multilateral development banks is a major one. But yesterday itself, the finance minister also talked about the fact that, and also when she met various ministers, including the Treasury Secretary of the US, Janet Yellen, she talked about the fact that there are a lot of global challenges, and these include climate change and rising debt in low-income countries. So the G20 is expected to focus on, the global economy, on strengthening the global economy, because growth is uneven now around the world because of various geopolitical events that have happened since last year. And you have had countries like Sri Lanka and Ghana, which have not been able to fallen short on paying up their debt. And so one doesn't want more countries, especially low-income countries, to follow suit. So these are the issues. There's also the issue of climate change, the impact of pandemics, which Janet Yellen talked about. And of course, today, as you said, the issue of strengthening the multilateral development banks, for which there is a special G20 working group. I think many recommendations, many issues were discussed, and they did discuss the fact that multilateral development banks don't need to be made any bigger. They need to be made more different. In fact, one of the terms being used was that they should really need to work as a family. And you rightly said, they're very big. So to reform a very large institution becomes very difficult. But if you have smaller institutions, then it would be far easier to not only to change them, but for countries to access them.
Let me also ask you, the fact that most of these multilateral development banks are dominated by the US, and we see that now, even as far as the economy is concerned, it's getting to be a more plural world, it's not dominated by one country. We have China, we have US, and of course we have our very own India, which is the world's fastest growing economy and world's fifth largest economy, having overtaken United Kingdom. So in this scenario, do you think that it's possible to kind of wake up and shake up these big banks?
No, I think there is a good chance. And I think, of course, you rightly pointed out that the US has been a major influence on the MDBs, as they are called. And they are, in fact, they call the shots, as it were, in perhaps the World Bank, in the International Monetary Fund. But of course, what is interesting right now is you head of the World Bank, who is a person of Indian origin, Ajay Banga. Yes. And, one looks forward to the fact that he would have greater empathy for the problems of people in lower income and developing economies, which is not to say that past World Bank chiefs have not had that. Despite the influence of the US, there has been the World Bank, especially, not so much the International Monetary Fund, but the World Bank itself has always had a greater focus on trying to help emerging economies, developing countries, and their focus has been concessional finance, whereas the International Monetary Fund looks more at restructuring policies and policies of countries which run into debt, and they tend to be more stringent in their proposals. But there is, since you rightly pointed out, that there is the influence of the larger economies on these institutions. It was for this reason that we had the creation of the BRICS Bank, the bank that was set up by the BRICS grouping, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So these countries have set up the BRICS Bank. Then there is the Asian Infrastructure Bank. So the other multilateral banks are being set up. But it is desirable, certainly, to reform the existing ones, because the World Bank as well as the IMF are the ones that countries come to when they are in dire need. Now, for instance, in the case of Sri Lanka or even Pakistan, when they have had economic crisis recently, they have reached out to the IMF, and it is the IMF which has come to their aid, to their rescue, as it were, even though they do lay down stringent conditionalities in terms of the policies that have to be changed.
Yes.
So therefore, it is important to reform these institutions.
All right. You spoke about the low-income countries. And so, Sushma, is it possible that the low-income countries can deal with debt distress? You just talked about Sri Lanka. The port was taken over by China because of the debt. And it's good that India is now dealing with Sri Lanka in rupee. That's a very positive sign. So, generally speaking, how can the countries mitigate debt distress in the international financial system?
Well, that's a very difficult situation, because here it is a situation where, it is only the multilateral agencies which have the heft to support countries. Now, for instance, India has done a great deal for Sri Lanka. It is its neighbor, and they have done a great deal. But then the heavy lifting has to be done by an institution like the IMF. I think one of the interesting recommendations that is being made over here has been proposed by this MDB reform committee. I don't think it's that. It's called the Working Group probably on International Financial Architecture, is to have global challenges funding mechanism and for global public goods, because it was pointed out during the discussions that, when a country is facing, dire issues of facing perhaps going into extreme poverty, they should not have to worry that, you are not meeting climate development goals or certain other goals which don't have relevance to it. So there should be a certain appreciation of the public goods, the requirement of each country, the public good of each country. So this is an interesting proposal to have a global challenges fund and funding mechanism rather for global public goods.
All right. There's also, when we talk about the official financing, there is a proposal that it should be split between concessional and non-concessional funds. You just talked about funding. What's your take on that? It said that on the concessional side, it is recommended that donors reorient aid programs towards multilateral channels to enhance coherence and leverage. And on the non-concessional finance, the CEF recommendations on balance sheet optimization and innovation capital should be implemented. Your take on this?
I think what is happening is that you're having a lot of individual countries who are doing bilateral financing of providing concessional finance bilaterally to low-income countries or even emerging economies like India. I mean, India also had till recently, of course, India is no longer accepting any kind of concessional assistance like that bilaterally. But in the past, we were. So you would have many of these countries which provide bilateral assistance. Now, this is rightly pointing out that all this should be brought through multilateral channels, through the multilateral development banks, and you can therefore coordinate. I mean, there's no point in having duplication of projects, of schemes, of financing proposals. There is bound to be a kind of overlapping and repetition. So this is meant as a kind of to coordinate the activities of these donors who are, of course, doing a good job, but this needs to be better coordinated. So as far as non-concessional finance is concerned, the proposal is to actually increase the amount that can be provided by the MDBs and in terms of providing capital increases to these MDBs so that they can raise the level of the amount which they provide to the countries which are facing debt distress.
And Sushma, what about the role of private sector participation? That's another factor that has which is now coming into focus. MDBs have a decisive role to play in mobilization and catalyzing such capital, as you mentioned now. So what would you say about that, the involvement of the private sector?
So the private sector is increasingly, we have to remember that we have very large corporations in the world, multinationals whose size or their turnover equals probably the budgets of some small countries or maybe even some large countries. So these are institutions that are also prepared to provide assistance, and they have the funds which can be channeled to help. Now, in India, I would perhaps give a very smaller comparison. In India, we have what is known as corporate social responsibility, that companies are required to provide a certain amount to helping out to do public good. Now, similarly, globally, there are private corporations they have their own foundations, they have funds, they do a lot of work in many areas. So this also can be tapped by the multilateral development banks, and which, for instance, the IMF used to be criticized for this, that they would go into a country and they would say, there's a standard list of things that you have to do to qualify for loans. And I must say, of course, the IMF has altered its strategy in that regard. But if you have smaller institutions, they are more flexible. And so this is one of, I think, the things that the G20 is looking at.
It's a bit of a challenge because G20 has countries which are developed and countries which are developing. And to have them on the same platform, it's a bit of a challenge there, isn't it?
Yes, but I think that's probably the advantage also of the G20, that instead of having a group like perhaps just the G7, which has only the rich countries in it, or a smaller grouping of maybe just Asian and African countries, here you have a platform where you have countries which are highly developed and you have emerging economies also over there, so that you can exchange the thoughts and exchange the ideas at one particular platform. And I think this is why probably the G20 is one of the most effective platforms, one of the most effective regional groupings that you can have. Well, I won't call it regional, it's a global grouping.
Yeah.
So it's one of the most effective global groupings that you can have, because you have such a variety of diversity of economies on this platform.
And despite the diversity, it's following the Indian philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So very rightly, we are leading it as far as the presidency is concerned this year in our country. Sushma, what about the fact that now there is also a talk of a triple mandate to address eliminating extreme poverty? India has been doing very well in that in the last few years, and the Niti Aayog has come up with some figures. What about inclusive growth and financing of global public goods? These three topics or aspects are now coming to the fore. What's your take on that?
Yes, I think the MDBs do have to take this up as mandate. That is, I think first one is really very important. That is elimination of extreme poverty. Because, these are countries, the low-income countries, they come to the multilateral development agencies only when they are in dire straits, only when they are not able to repay their loans and they come. But I think there has to be a strategy whereby these economies, these countries, they are brought into a more inclusive growth model before they reach the before they hit the complete bottom, as it were, before they are not able to pay their loans. I think they should be provided assistance. And for that, you require a monitoring mechanism in the MDBs, And again, I come back to the thing that if you have a smaller MDB, you would be able to maybe have one MDB which would focus on a particular continent or a particular region. And that would be able to perhaps look more closely at the problems of countries like Sri Lanka or Ghana or Zambia. These are the countries which have been facing acute distress in recent years, and come to some productive conclusions and offer productive suggestions before the country reaches a state of extreme financial distress, debt distress. Yes, and thereby improve the situation of extreme poverty.
Well, I think the fact that COVID happened and then the Ukraine-Russia war happened, and these two instances taught us that it's actually a symbiotic world where each one is dependent on one another. So in that spirit of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, India is taking forward the G20 presidency in our country, and that's a matter of pride, and I think it's just right that we are discussing here on Akashvani. Well, thank you so much, Sushma Ramachandran, dating us with your views and reviews. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lalima.
You are listening to a discussion on India's G20 presidency and reforming international financial architecture. The participants were Sushma Ramachandran, economic analyst, and Lalima Aneja, anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsttalks@gmail.com.